Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Sonnenstein. I'm one of the editors at Shadowproof, and I'm joined here by Kevin Gosztola, my co-founder and editor. How are you doing today, Kevin?
Hey, Brian, it's great to be with you.
Today, we are going to be talking about some work that you've done over the weekend that's caught a lot of people's attention, and I think rightfully so. You found that over the weekend, DNC Chair Tom Perez released his nomination for the convention committees for the Democratic National Convention in 2020. And you dug into some of who those people are, and we wanted to bring you on and have a conversation and sort of dig a little bit deeper into the significance of all of this, and who some of these people are and what it says about sort of the path between now and the primary and the nomination process at the convention. I just wanted to remind people before we dive in to please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be, doing these kinds of ad hoc streaming events in addition to doing the Dissenter Weekly Update, which is a program that you host every week, Kevin, on Thursdays at 4 Eastern. So please subscribe to keep up to date on that. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, if you don't already. And we are 100% reader-funded organization. So, if you can kick in a couple dollars as a donation or join as a member, it really helps us out. So with that being said, I just wanted to jump right in here, Kevin. You have a thread on Twitter that we will link to in the description here. You wrote a great piece for the Gray Zone. It's titled "To Rig Primary Against Bernie." DNC's Tom Perez nominates regime change agents, Israel lobbyists, and Wall Street consultants. To start, can you just tell us a little bit, lay the groundwork? What is the DNC? Who is Tom Perez? What's the significance of these nominees in the entire process?
Yeah, and it's really crucial to begin by just giving people the context, because the Twitter thread that's out there goes through each of these individuals. It mentions each of the individual committees, but what you don't get is this full picture of what it means and how all of these people can slide into their roles and the effect that they could have on the direction of the Democratic Party, in spite of the surge that we're seeing from the Bernie Sanders campaign, in spite of some of the support we've seen for other candidates like Liz Warren and Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang and other more progressive candidates that have thrown their hats into the ring in the last year. And so what you have are, for the 2020 convention, you have these standing committees that an executive committee that is run or chaired by Tom Perez. Of course, Tom Perez came from the Labor Department in President Barack Obama's administration. He defeated Keith Ellison, who was a representative in Congress. Keith Ellison had been a part of the Sanders campaign, had been a Sanders surrogate. He was also a delegate on the DNC's Platform Drafting Committee back in 2016. And then in 2017, you had Perez actually purge a few individuals from this executive committee, including James Zogby, who is somebody who had wanted to change language in the platform to be more representative of how Israel has a military occupation, to change it so that it spoke to the humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza with Palestinians. So you have Perez taking that action. But there was also a unity reform commission that was put together. And you had the Sanders people pushing for superdelegates to be abolished. And you had the Clinton campaign, people who were connected to it. You had people who were connected to the DNC responding to this insurgency that wanted to do away with superdelegates, because rightfully they said that those people had thrown out, they said they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton very early, before any primaries or caucuses had taken place. And so they believed that they were tipping the scales in favor of Hillary Clinton. It added to this discussion about how the DNC had rigged the primary in such a way that it favored the primary process favored Hillary Clinton. And so you have this commission meet, and they reduce the influence of superdelegates. And superdelegates no longer, there are more than 700 of them, no longer do they get to vote and be involved in selecting the nominee until after the first ballot. So if Bernie Sanders wins on the first ballot, then these people who are superdelegates don't get to impose their will, and they don't get to go against the people. They don't get to go against their states. If their state voted for Bernie Sanders, then they don't get that opportunity to vote for a Joe Biden or to vote for a Mike Bloomberg or somebody else. So you have each of these committees, and the executive committee met on January 25th, but we don't have a whole lot of information about what happened with this committee meeting. It's very secretive. You can't go to the DNC's website and find a whole list of the members who make up this executive committee. It's hard to find. I was not able to find a list of who's on this executive committee. There's an older dated list of who's members in this executive committee from 2016 to 2020. But some of those people are no longer on because, as I said before, Tom Perez removed a few people who were had supported Keith Ellison against him or who were supporters of Sanders. So so he nominated these people to Credentials Committee, to the Platform Committee, and to a Rules Committee. And they were appointed presumably on January 25th. So we're talking here about people who are now on these committees. We know that the executive committee meeting did take place in Milwaukee on January 25th because there was at least one member who tweeted a photo about it showing that they were at this committee meeting. So you have co-chairs that were selected and you have vice chairs that were appointed. They were elected by the executive committee. They do not have voting power, but they get to be involved in administering and helping to manage these committees. The Platform Committee is very straightforward. We know what the Platform Committee does. The Platform Committee is involved in drafting the essential policies and the vision that the Democratic Party is going to put forward in 2020 to make voters enthusiastic for supporting Democrats. And that's going to be the opportunity for Bernie to add things to the platform like support for Medicare for all, support for a ban on fracking, etc. Except if you stack the Platform Committee with people who are involved in corporate consulting or are against this and represent industry interests, then you might not be able to get those kinds of planks into the platform. The Rules Committee, is going to be involved in handling these processes and these procedures, managing this kind of thing. You're going to have this Credentials Committee. This Credentials Committee is involved in hearing any challenges to anybody's credentials as to whether they're in good standing to remain as an official part of the Democratic National Convention or even a part of the DNC, hearing challenges to whether those people should be thrown out and not be able to have influence on what happens. So these committees are where you could imagine a lot of battles are going to play out between the factions in the party, the people who are in the establishment, who have their links to the Clinton campaign, who have their ties to the Obama presidency, who have their ties to you go as far back to President Bill Clinton. And then you also are going to have the insurgency, this insurgency of people who have come into the party as a result of supporting Bernie Sanders. And the people we know who are going to be there, because as of now, we see Sanders surging. He's done very well at raising money. He's in first place. He's opening up leads that are somewhere in the range of 5 and 8% ahead of people like Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. So he's going to be someone who's in the race for the long haul, and there's going to be many, many people that the Democratic Party has to contend with. And in preparation, you can stack each of these committees with people who represent the neoliberal agenda that the Democratic Party has been putting forward for the last 20 to 30 years, going back to the rise of the New Democrats in the 1980s. And you also have people who can protect the status quo when it comes to the foreign policy that the Democratic Party has supported, when it comes to the way in which they think about how the U.S. should intervene and be involved in conflict, waging war. You have people on there that's amenable to who are amenable to that. You have people who are pro-Israel Democrats who can protect the status quo when it comes to supporting Israel and not doing much to acknowledge that there in fact is an apartheid regime set up against Palestinians. So I think that's a good background to bring us up to what could possibly happen in July. I'm going to refrain from speculation because I don't think that gets us anywhere. So I don't know. Nobody here in this video today, Brian or myself, can say exactly what's going to happen. I don't think it's fairly unpredictable right now. What we know as an aside quickly, then we'll get to the business of the day, which is the individuals who are going to be on these standing committees. We have pieces from people like Jennifer Rubin at Washington Post and David Frum at The Atlantic that indicate the panic among the establishment right now at what Bernie is able to do. They're pretty much begging someone to find some kind of opposition research that they could then deploy and share and use it to smear Bernie Sanders' campaign and bring him down. They really are desperate to find something to kneecap him because everything that they've thrown in the past year when he seemed to be a threat hasn't paid off for them. And he still has a lot of momentum. And he has a lot of momentum in the right moment, like right when people are going to go to primaries and go vote in the first caucuses, which is when you really can seal up a nomination. I mean, that's what Hillary Clinton wanted to do, is to have all this momentum in 2016. And then Bernie Sanders came along and stifled it a little bit or created competition to where he was winning some states, she was winning some states. So it wasn't a thing where she was able to just roll and then be done with it and have the nomination. So they're afraid that I think they're afraid that Bernie's going to do what Hillary Clinton couldn't do in 2016. And they want to prevent that from happening.
That's great. Thank you for that overview. That's really good. And just once again, I want to remind people to please check out your piece in the Gray Zone and to go on Twitter and check out your thread. I did want to jump into who some of these people are, who their backgrounds are, if they've been involved in this process before. I know that, like I said, you have a big long thread looking into a lot of these people. I don't know if we're going to go into all of them today, but who stands out to you? Who are some of the people right off the bat that you think people should know about, and what their presence on these committees means?
Right. So the first thing that stands out are the people who you see who you know from experience with 2016 have open animosity towards Bernie Sanders, but also were part of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I'm thinking of people like Barney Frank, who is a former representative in Congress. He was hostile towards Bernie Sanders in 2016. Bernie Sanders actually tried to get him removed because he was in this. He's nominated for the Rules Committee chair, a chair position. And he was in a kind of leadership position like that in 2016. And Bernie tried to get him removed, but was not successful because he was writing columns against Bernie about how progressives shouldn't support Bernie Sanders. So you see people on here that like Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who is with was a Kamala Harris campaign surrogate, also worked on the campaign. You see people on here like Jake Sullivan, who worked for the Clinton campaign, John Podesta, who worked for the Clinton campaign. You see individuals down here like Wendy Sherman and Carol Browner, who were delegates that Clinton appointed to be on the Platform Drafting Committee. You see people who endorsed Hillary Clinton fairly early in the race, including in like 2015, before anybody had voted in any primaries or caucuses. Some of these people are from unions that endorsed Hillary Clinton early. I believe there's a guy who his name's Pallone. There's someone from the UFCW who endorsed Hillary Clinton very early. even though they were in this fight against Walmart, and Hillary Clinton was once on the board of Walmart. And so, anyways, those are examples. Those are kind of things I just wanted to give you a sense of what I was looking for when I started to do my research. I immediately zeroed in on some of these people who, have this animosity and bias towards someone who could potentially become the nominee of the Democratic Party. And the glaring thing was that when you looked at this list, I see Larry Cohen, who is the former union president of the Communication Workers of America. And then I don't see a whole lot of any other people who could be said to be linked to the Sanders campaign in 2016. So you get the sense that already there's this unfairness built into these DNC standing committees going forward. I think for the sake of us having only 15 or 20 more minutes that we're going to go here, I'm going to focus on the platform committee because I really think that's where some of the most significant battles can happen. It should be said that some of the people who are on these committees are superdelegates and were superdelegates in 2016. So not only are they on these committees, but they also have that power to stifle and disrupt a nomination of Bernie Sanders in July. But okay, let's look at, we have Dennis McDonough, and Dennis McDonough was the chief of staff for Barack Obama when he was when Barack had his second term. Dennis McDonough is actually someone that I discovered had come up with this thing called the Rework America Task Force. He's with this firm called the Markle Foundation, and they partnered in 2018. He partnered with Heidi Capazzi, who is a senior vice president of human resources at Boeing, to form this Rework America Business Network. And I discovered that it included 11 founding members: Aon, Archer Daniels Midland Company, Boeing, of course, Duke Energy, being involved in pollution of the environment, Kaiser Permanente, McKinsey and Company. McKinsey, of course, has received attention because of Pete Buttigieg's ties to McKinsey. There's Microsoft, Stanley Black & Decker, Walmart, Zurich Insurance, and 21st Century Fox. And the network even received some support from Google. So that to me was a big red flag. And these are corporations. These are people who McDonough is going to collaborate with to try to supposedly help workers get skills training. But this is the kind of policy that the Democratic Party thinks is the answer to dealing with economic injustice. It doesn't really get us anywhere when it comes to addressing poverty. So that's the kind of ideology that Dennis McDonough brings as the co-chair, as somebody who's going to be co-chairing the platform committee, is going to be steering people to limit the sort of policies that can be put forward to challenge certain neoliberal policies. You have the reality too that he acted on behalf of the CIA to argue for more redactions from the torture report summary that was being put out by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He was recently depicted. John Hamm played him in The Report, the Amazon movie that was released last year in 2019. And he was a friend. He's buddy with John Brennan, the former CIA director, and he fought for him. He was really against the delays that were happening as people mulled over John Brennan's past support for waterboarding and torture in the CIA program. And so there's that. And then the fact that he was an advisor who was had Obama's ear as the drone program was being developed, this policy to assassinate alleged terrorism suspects who could be killed extrajudicially. And so I think of someone like Dennis McDonough as being a really big red flag. I think Jake Sullivan is another person who was the national security advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, not only because Joe Biden is actually in the race and running as a candidate, but also because he worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign We have Podesta emails that were published by WikiLeaks that show his animosity towards Bernie Sanders, but we also know he's part of something called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's on their advisory council. This council is set up in the whole period when this hysteria around Russia in meddling in the 2016 election was at its peak. You have people on this council like Michael Chertoff, who's the former Homeland Security Secretary, Bill Kristol, a neoconservative who pushed for the Iraq War, Michael McFaul, John Podesta's on this. And actually, John Podesta got a position on one of the committees. You have Mike Rogers, the former Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee. And for those of you who don't know, the Alliance for Securing Democracy is essentially an outfit that's been engaged in modern day McCarthyism. It claims to be able to identify people, individuals, as well as media outlets that are quote unquote vehicles for Kremlin propaganda, as the Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal put it. And in fact, they don't have a really good track record of being able to identify these people. They just are doing this to discredit dissent against U.S. foreign policy. You look at some of the others. We have people here like Bakari Sellers, Dan Shapiro, Wendy Sherman, and Megan Stabler. What I found was that there's actually a group that was set up last year in 2019 called the Democratic Majority for Israel in order to fight the influence that people who support Palestinian rights might be having on the Democratic Party, in order to fight the influence of people who want to see us take a stronger attack against Israel. And it might even support the positions of Bernie, who says that, he's not as great. He has his own problems with the way he addresses it, but he at least wants Israel and Palestine to be on an even footing when they come to the table to discuss how to resolve what's been going on for many, many decades. And he says, Israel's just as responsible for the human rights abuses. I mean, and they need to be blamed as well. And that is very irritating for people who are involved in Israel lobbying efforts. Bakari Sellers is someone who is appointed to a position. He was nominated for the Platform Committee. And Bakari really stands out to me because he's somebody who has been involved in casting aspersions and being negative and hostile to Bernie Sanders since 2016. He's suggested openly that Bernie has a long way to go with Black voters. And he's downplayed the role that Bernie Sanders had in the civil rights movement, suggesting that he hasn't done anything for Black people since the 1960s. Can you imagine if somebody who was aligned or had any connection to the Sanders campaign was on a DNC standing committee and talked like that openly? They would probably be booted from that standing committee. And he's talked about that against someone who is going to be potentially the nominee of the Democratic Party. He's a member of the National Council of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is AIPAC. And in 2016, he fought to make sure that the DNC Platform Drafting Committee did not adopt any language that would address the crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza. He believes that BDS is actually creating anti-Semitism, as do other people like Wendy Sherman, and who is on the Platform Committee, was nominated to be someone who serves on the Platform Committee again this year. And so these are some of the people you have people. So we've gone through some of the people who are pro-Israel Democrats, but then you have people who are just corporate. What I came across was an example of people who are on this group called the Dewey Square Group. And Dewey Square Group is something that The Intercept has called attention to because they undermined health reform, and they fought against other progressive policies. And you've got people like Minion Moore, you've got Maria Cardona, and you have people like Charlie Baker, who's the president and founder, who is involved in representing these corporate interests, and they're actually on this board. There are people who are on the boards of think tanks like the National Endowment for Democracy. I was really stunned to find a couple of people who could be linked back to them and their project. And the reason I was stunned was because people who don't know, the National Endowment for Democracy was set up by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s when the CIA was facing a backlash for its meddling and destabilization of countries around the world, for fighting for regime change in different countries. And the answer that they came up with in the Reagan administration was to just bring some of this stuff out in the open and to remove the stigma, just to openly do it. And then instead of doing it covertly and risk people being offended by it or people being outraged by it, we could just do it openly, and then maybe people would just get used to it. It would become normal. We'll get used to it. So they've been doing this kind of thing. They do this kind of work in Latin American countries. Ned has a project called the National Democratic Institute, which does some work on funding kind of regime change operations we see happen around the globe that the U.S. wants to promote. And Elizabeth Bagley and Michael Steed are two individuals who I found who are on this board, and both of them are on committees. Elizabeth Bagley's on a credentials committee, and Michael Steed is on the rules committee. And so there's that. There are several other people that we could run down, but essentially what you find is this web of people who are just intricately connected within this world of the corporate world and in the world of people who are pursuing U.S. empire. Heidi Heitkamp, the former U.S. senator, is on the McCain Institute now. She's one of the members of that. The McCain Institute is fascinating because she was brought on board. She claims to be involved in helping the think tank fight human trafficking, but in reality, what they're doing is no different than any other think tank. They're just using this as a way to conceal the fact that they do what all kinds of these think tanks do, which is to create relationships with corporations and business executives around the world, to create relationships with governments, to advance U.S. policy through those foreign governments. So what you see is all the people who are on this are involved in protecting the status quo. The one last point I'll make is that you have individuals on there like Maria Cardona, who is a CNN and CNN and Espanol contributor. Not the only CNN contributor. The other CNN contributor is Bakari Sellers. But you have Maria Cardona, who, I learned had actually been involved in helping the Commerce Department with their messaging on NAFTA back in 1993. But also, she penned these couple of pieces where she's gone after Bernie Sanders for wanting to change the United States to transform the United States into Venezuela. She's argued against socialism, basically invoking this right-wing attack that President Donald Trump and Republicans use all the time in order to go after Bernie Sanders. And they say, you'll hear this thing of like, Bernie Sanders can't run against Donald Trump because when he does, he's going to have a really rough time because they're just going to come after him for being a socialist, and they're gonna point to all these other places. But this is exactly what they do. They're actually saying that this is the attack because this is the attack that they have in their head. This is why they don't like Bernie Sanders. So they are pathologizing this thing that they say Donald Trump is going to do to make it impossible for us to have a Democratic candidate win the presidency in 2020. So I think that's a lot of information. There's so much to try to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's great work.
That is in this list. You could spend days talking about these people, and I'm fairly certain that I've only scratched the surface when it comes to what these people are involved in. I mean, Paladin Capital Group that Michael Steed is on was accused of pay-for-play corruption and managing a pension fund business and managing pension funds in New York and had to settle in 2010. I learned that Barney Frank is on the board of Signature Bank New York, which is this bank that I didn't know the New York Times had examined in 2018 and found it was a go-to lender for Donald Trump and Jared Kushner's families. So this is insane. You have Barney Frank lecturing Bernie Sanders on what to do, and he's
Right.
on the board. He's on the board of a bank that has actually helped Donald Trump finance his own assets and manage his own assets. It's incredible. So
Yeah.
it's like, so we could spend a long time going on. We need to probably conclude. So I'll let you steer me towards a conclusion.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's very excellent work, great digging. I have to commend you for the mountain of effort that takes. So thank you very much for that. And as you mentioned earlier, we're still waiting for the executive committee nominations to figure out who's been placed there. So certainly more digging to come, and hopefully we'll get our hands on that soon. I guess in conclusion, I wanted you to sort of give us a look at the path forward. You've talked a little bit about some of the obstacles facing, for example, the Bernie Sanders campaign. What are some of the things that maybe we can expect to see, heading into some of the first contests and, on our way into the actual convention? What should people be looking out for? What is there left to be done? And, any other thoughts that you had that you'd like to share?
First, I would say that I believe that the Sanders campaign is fully aware of how these committees are stacked. Jordan Chariton has a show called Status Coup, and he just interviewed Nina Turner, and she spoke about how she was appalled at who was placed on these standing committees. The Sanders campaign has David Sirota as one of their speechwriters, and so and he's been involved in advising the campaign, and he works with their newsletter, sending the newsletter out on Substack called Burn Notice. And he did this kind of research and journalism that I spent like 24 to 48 hours doing. He's done that far more extensively than I've done, and he's well aware of how lobbying firms and corporate consultants and think tanks and all these other people have their grubby little hands in and outside of the Democratic Party and are steering the direction of our politics. He knows how they're influencing our media, and they're paying attention to all of this. I think Bernie knows because on January 27th, on January 26th, he was in Sioux City, Iowa, and he spoke about how the establishment was panicking, that this nightmare is coming, that there's this surge happening, and that the drug companies and the insurance companies and the fossil fuel industry and all of these people are panicked because they see that out there might be the numbers for winning this nomination. You had The Intercept reporting that they were actually telling volunteers to back off the phone calls to people in Iowa because there were just so many. They were like, stop carpet bombing the phone lines. You're going to make people upset, and then they might not want to vote for us. So we need to fine tune and retool what we're doing here. We can still use these resources. You're still usable, but we're going to give you different jobs for the time being so that we can lay off these calls for just a little bit. We're going to see, it's very clear, a ramping up of the kind of pieces I mentioned from Jennifer Rubin and David Fromm, and there was a whole piece from the New York Times about Bernie's internet army. I think people should be prepared for more pieces like that are intended to negatively address and discuss and describe Bernie Sanders' campaign to people. I mean, I don't know if those are going to work, though, because the ground game that the Bernie Sanders campaign seems to have is really strong, and they're having those one-on-one interactions with voters that make more difference than people who, it's far more substantial than someone reading a New York Times article, because, you can talk to voters, find out what they're reading, and then dismantle myths that they might have in their heads. So, on one hand, I saw a collective reaction to this list where people thought, this is very bleak. This shows how they've rigged the 2020 convention, and there's no way Bernie Sanders could be the nominee. We're going to have the same outcome that we had in 2016. In fact, it's pretty clear now that the Democrats are going to lose to Donald Trump, and they're going to do it all over again, and then they're going they're going to blame Bernie Sanders supporters for this. They're going to blame all the people who were Bernie or bust. They're going to blame people who decided to stay home and not vote. They're going to go after non-voters and suggest that they were like un-American for not participating. They're not going to take the lesson that they should have in 2016, and they're going to repeat all the same because they're so entrenched in this corporate interests and all these other stuff. But I don't know if that's exactly the case. I think that we need to see a lot play out in February and March before we can say that that is what's going to happen, because Bernie Sanders might come in very, very strong in July. So I think the most you can say based on these convention standing committee appointments right now is that the Democratic National Committee has no intent to change its politics one iota, even in the face of the Sanders campaign and its energy and the way in which it's transformed people, the way it's promoted certain policy ideas like Medicare for all and ban on fracking, the Green New Deal, these different things that have become fixtures of what progressives are fighting for. They have no intention of supporting those. By putting these people on these committees, it's pretty apparent that they have absolutely no interest whatsoever in supporting this politics. But to conclude here, to say finally, that may not matter, because it could be really embarrassing for the Democratic Party if Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee, or if Bernie and Warren do something together to become the nominee, or if some of these smaller candidates end up providing delegates to help Bernie win the nomination. And then he has the nomination, he gets to pick his running mate, and then those two individuals who are probably going to be the strongest, most progressive left-wing people in the history of the Democratic Party in the modern era, they can go out and campaign on whatever they would like to campaign for, and they don't have to pay any attention to this Democratic Party platform. We know that for the most part, it's not even binding. It's just the sense of the Democratic Party. It exists. So what you would have is a document, a platform, and a party that is showing that they're still stuck in their own corporate ways, while Bernie Sanders speaks to where people are at on economic, social issues, on racial issues, and on environmental issues. And he just presses ahead, pursues his agenda regardless of where they want to take this, where they want to keep this party, because they're for the status quo, and then everyone else is trying to move things in a direction that deals with the climate change threat and that deals with people's basic human needs. So I think that's where we conclude. And I think there's going to be a lot of journalism that needs to be done on what is going on with these committees. There's more work that I could do. There's more work that we should do that exists entirely outside the Trump impeachment trial, that exists entirely out of where the Democratic Party's focus is right now, because I don't think they understand at all what it takes to win in November. But I believe that there are people who have been volunteering for Bernie Sanders, for Warren, for even Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and other campaigns who do have some knowledge of what it takes to actually defeat Donald Trump in 2020.
Thank you, Kevin. Very well said, and I completely agree with you there. We will be on this story and other stories related to it. I would encourage folks to check us out, shadowproof.com, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you can, please chip in a couple dollars, either as a one-time donation or join our membership program. You are what helps Kevin do the incredible work that he's doing, and all of our other writers. And every little bit helps. So Kevin, again, thank you so much for this, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Thanks for listening.